All right, and I'll also juggle letting people in. Well, welcome to all of you. Thanks again for coming. If you don't know me, my name is Brandon Morgan. I am a history instructor at CNM. Many of you are in my Intro to Historical Study class. That's the kind of jumping off point for me organizing this afternoon's talk. So in Intro to Historical Study, we're thinking about the skills, processes, methods that historians undertake in order to figure out and understand what happened in the past. We've just talked about secondary sources a bit over the last couple of weeks in terms of how we should approach those from a critical angle. And last week we started looking at primary sources in class. So Dr. Cahill is going to bring some of those things together for us in her talk. And again, I'm so thrilled to have her with us. So Dr. Cathleen Cahill is a friend, a colleague, and a mentor of mine. She was one of the professors that taught me Western US history at UNM when I was a grad student. I did my MA and PhD over there at UNM. Dr. Cahill was there during that time. Now she's at Penn State. She studies the history of gender and most recently voting in the American West. And she can say a lot more about her research in detail, but I'm just very pleased to have her with us, and I've always admired her work, and so this is a great pleasure. So I will turn the time over to you, Dr. Cahill.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really thrilled to be here with you today, and thank you for inviting me. I miss New Mexico a great deal. So any excuse to, even if it's only virtually, be back there, I'm delighted by. And I'm really excited to share my work with you today. And I'm a big fan of images. So I have a ton of images, probably too many. But you can think about those right as primary sources, both the photographs, and then I do have some actual written sources, sort of more traditional sources in the slides too. So when we get to the Q&A section, I'm happy to talk about where they are or how I use them or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is talk for about a half an hour about the history of women's suffrage in New Mexico, which is what my most recent book was partially on. I looked at 6 women of color across the country, but I focused on New Mexico for part of it. And you'll see that I think New Mexico is a really interesting place to look to talk about how women's experiences really varied in terms of why they were fighting for suffrage, how they fought, and sort of what they gained and when they gained it. So part of what I was interested in was really these sort of where women's experiences were similar and where they were different and why. So let me pull up my PowerPoint here. Like I said, there's a lot of them, so I may go a little fast through them. And I'm going to start actually with this one, and it's the worst photo. I apologize. It's in the Center for Southwest. No, it's from Silver City, but it's digitized through the center. And I'm going to start with a suffrage fact. According to historian Joan Jensen, who teaches at NMSU, in 1910, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was the main organization in the country, had 2 women on its list kind of as members from New Mexico. One was recorded as dead. There was like a little note by her name, and the other was in a Silver City tuberculosis sanatorium. Now, just 10 years later, New Mexico would become the 32nd state to ratify the 19th Amendment, which was the amendment that said the vote cannot be denied on the basis of sex, right? So this seems like a pretty sudden shift. And so the question is, what happened, right? Well, one of the things I argue is that suffrage in New Mexico wouldn't have been successful without the cooperation of Spanish-speaking women and politicians. But also, as you'll see, even in New Mexico, where there was cooperation between particularly Anglos and Hispanas, there was still the pall of racial prejudice that marred other sections of the country, also sort of impacted New Mexico, but in kind of unique ways. So that Nassau member who was in the sanatorium might have still been there in 1911 when this 4th of July parade took place. And you can see there was this float in the parade, which is actually a group of men dressed up in women's clothing, carrying signs saying votes for women and Bullock's Indians. And Bullock, Dr. Bullock was the head of the sanatorium. So this is kind of a jokey float about suffrage and suffragists, and the men are making fun of them, right? And apparently everyone found it very funny. But the idea that this Bullock's Indians sign was that often in popular culture, suffragists who were seen as kind of wild and unruly women were equated with Native women who were also seen, right, stereotypically as wild and unruly. So we know that this is a critical statement about suffrage, but it also reveals to us how when Americans were thinking about suffrage, they're often also thinking about race. Right? So we'll come back to that. You know, part of the reason I wrote this book is because most of the suffrage stories that you'll hear about are set back east, right? They're in New York, they're in Philadelphia, they're in Washington, D.C., and we don't hear as much about the West. And so I wanted to know what happened if we looked at New Mexico and how that might change our story. So I'm going to start in 1910. But if you're interested in sort of how Native people in New Mexico were thinking about the right to vote, there's a really great book, I think potentially by one of your colleagues in the PhD program, named Maurice Crandall, whose book, These People Have Always Been a Republic, is a great book. And I have further readings at the end for everyone. It's on there. So in 1910, New Mexico, of course, is making its bid for statehood, and was busy trying to write a new constitution. Oh, we'll come back to that, state constitution. And I just want to give you a sense of the population here. As you can see, right, Hispanos or Nuevo Mexicanos were the majority population. And most of those people had US citizenship because they came into the nation under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave Mexican citizens citizenship. But it didn't include Native Americans, right? Even though they'd formerly been Mexican citizens, when they come into the United States, they're treated instead as indigenous nations. And after the Civil War, their status, the federal government determined that they were what it called wards of the native. So they don't have a legal standing. They're right with, for example, a contemporary example is Britney Spears under her conservatorship, right? She's not a full, she doesn't have full legal rights. So this is how Native people were seen, but the government was their conservator. So they, at this time, the government is instituting all of these policies to quote unquote civilize them. So dividing tribally held land into private property, the boarding schools, where removing Native children from their families, these sorts of things. And of course, wards cannot vote or participate politically. So that's for Native people in New Mexico, they're kind of out of those conversations around suffrage. So the number of Anglo-Americans was growing in large part due to the railroads, but Spanish-speaking New Mexicans are still quite powerful in the state in 1912. So just the bigger context is the rest of the country is, of course, a little hesitant to allow New Mexico to become a state. They're worried that the Spanish-speaking population is too foreign, right? Even though they're part of the country. They're worried that they're too Catholic. And so Congress had initially said that the new constitution, the state constitution, had to have an English-only provision, that only English office holders had to be proficient in English, and public school instruction would all be in English, right? And of course, then the other bigger context is the women's suffrage movement is happening throughout the country as well. So suffrage, women's suffrage, language, and religion are all questions that are part of this state constitutional convention. And Spanish-speaking women play a role in all of those debates right along with Anglo women. And I just want to introduce two of those women really quickly. On the right with the hat is Nina Otero Warren, whom you might have heard of. She's from a prominent political family. Her cousin had been appointed territorial governor by William McKinley, and many of her other male family members were politicians. On the other side, without the hat, is Aurora Lucero. She was the daughter of a newspaper editor and politician, Antonio Lucero, who ultimately was the first New Mexico Secretary of State. So at the time of the Constitutional Convention, Lucero was a college student, and she entered a speech contest. It was a statewide speech contest, and she gave a talk called "Shall the Spanish Language Be Taught in the Schools of New Mexico?" or in Spanish, "Defensa de Nuestro Idioma." And this was a direct response actually to Congress's insistence on English only. And it gave these powerful arguments about why Spanish was an important language, that Spanish speakers had things to help the nation. And particularly, she talks about kind of how they can help in relation to the US's Spanish-speaking colonies like Puerto Rico and the Philippines, but also sort of efforts in South America, Latin America. And this speech, which gets reprinted, has a big impact, right? And some historians credit her with really influencing legislators, but also the public, right? And this is something that a lot of Spanish speakers feel strongly about. So those politicians writing the Constitution make sure to include protections for Spanish language rights and freedom of religion, right? So in contrast to what Congress wanted. And you can see this is really powerful language about protecting rights, right? Shouldn't be restricted in terms of religion, race, language, or color, or illiteracy in English or Spanish, right? So they do, however, state there's an exception. There are two exceptions. They say there's the exceptions in this Constitution, and those exceptions are, first, Indians not taxed, which are most Native peoples, any Native person who's considered a federal ward. And secondly, it's women whose voting rights were restricted in this Constitution. Okay. We'll get to this, but basically women could only vote in school elections was what this Constitution said. Women had lobbied for full suffrage rights. The New Mexico Federation of Women's Clubs had been lobbying the folks who were writing the Constitution for that. And those members of that club were mostly Anglo, but there were a few Hispanas, especially in Santa Fe. But ultimately, that was seen as too far. So women were given rights to vote for school issues because that had to do with children. And there was a sense that, right, women are maternal and, right, they deal with children, and so they should have some say in that. Now, having protected the right of Spanish-speaking men to vote and, right, the rights of Spanish speakers and Catholics, they made the Constitution really hard to change. So you can see at least 3/4 of the electors voting in the whole state, and then at least 2/3 of those voting in each county. That's a huge bar, and that's what was required to make any changes to these constitutions. So to change the women's suffrage clause meant that women in New Mexico at the state level would have to get an enormous number of people to vote. It's almost impossible, right? And that part of the Constitution only applied to voting, didn't apply to any other amendments, but specifically to voting. And to protect, again, Spanish-speaking men's voting rights in particular. So the national organization, NASA, that I mentioned, was focused on state-by-state voting rights at this time. That was its strategy, was try to get women in each state to win at the state level. So for New Mexico, that's not really a useful strategy once this Constitution goes into effect. But in 1913, that changes on the national level. A young activist named Alice Paul, who had spent time with radical suffragists in England, came back to the US and wanted to shake things up. And in particular, she thought this state-by-state strategy was way too slow, and she wanted to go for a constitutional amendment. And she famously announces this strategy at this huge suffrage parade in Washington, DC, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration parade. So she kind of upstages his parade. And you can see they have this float saying, "We demand an amendment enfranchising women." It was said that every state was represented in this march. And I haven't found any evidence that anyone from New Mexico was actually there. I'm still looking, but I still haven't found it. But you can see that all of the states had someone carrying a sign that sort of represented them. Some were women from those states. Possibly someone connected to New Mexico's delegation might have been there, their congressional delegation, but they said they were represented. So organizers from Alice Paul's new group called the National Women's Party came to New Mexico touting this new strategy of constitutional amendment, and they met a lot of women in the state who were on board, right? Because this was the only way the federal constitution would override New Mexico's state constitution, right? So that's the only way, practical way that they saw women in New Mexico being able to get full voting rights. Now, Nina Otero Warren and Aurora Lucero become leaders in this organization. And more than that, they emphasize that suffrage won't succeed in New Mexico if these national organizers don't reach out to Spanish-speaking women, right? They recognize that there are a number of Spanish-speaking politicians, and those men need to be influenced by people from their community. They insist that suffrage literature be printed in Spanish and English, that speeches should be in both Spanish and English. And the National Women's Party organizers were actually pretty open to this, which is kind of surprising considering how they treated, say, African-American women elsewhere in the country. So they incorporate Nina Otero Warren and Aurora Lucero into their cause. One of the first organizers they send out was a woman from South Carolina named Ella St. Clair Thompson. And she wrote back to Alice Paul that she spoke some Spanish herself. She thought it was a beautiful language. And she said it really helped that she could speak a little bit when she was in New Mexico. When she came out to visit in October 1915, the women of Santa Fe actually organized a suffrage parade in Santa Fe. And about 150 women joined this parade, both Anglos and Hispanas. Mrs. Trinidad Cabeza de Vaca was, her family had one of the few cars in the city, and so she lent her car for this parade. And other women with political connections. The first New Mexico librarian, Lola Armijo, was in the parade. And they march kind of through the city. They start at the plaza and they march around and they end at the home of Senator Thomas Catron, right? And he's the man in this photograph. He's a notorious anti-suffragist, okay? But they know they have to sort of try to lobby him. They designate 4 women to give speeches to him. 2 are in English and 2 are in Spanish. Aurora Lucero gave one of them, and Mrs. Cleofas Romero gave the other Spanish language speech. And they ask him to support the amendment. He basically greets them very politely. He's very polite to them, listens to them, and then proceeds to mansplain to them, in our parlance, why suffrage for women is a bad idea. And he has a whole series of arguments. Men and women are extremely different, and women are not suited for politics. That's a male sphere. He said women are dissexed, right? Become less womanly if they're in public in politics. He points to women who were anti-suffrage. There were some anti-suffrage women and said, look, women don't even want it. You're just rabble-rousing. And he also raised the issue that many of his colleagues in Congress from the South were worried that Black women would get the vote and this would disrupt social relationships in the South. And I'm going to show you a card that I just want to warn you has some racist language on it, but this was the kind of thing that was being handed around in Georgia at this time, right? So this is why people were against women's suffrage. And in particular, right, basically because it would allow Black people to vote and that white supremacy must be maintained, right? Now, the national organizer from the National Women's Party says to him at this meeting, oh, don't worry, because each state votes individually or determines voters individually, all of those Jim Crow laws in the South that keep Black men from voting will also keep Black women from voting. So it's not a problem, right? And so that's kind of the line that white suffragists were taking with white Southerners, was it's okay for you to discriminate against African Americans, but you should still support white women's right to vote. The next year, another national organizer came and they established an official branch of the National Women's Party in New Mexico. And again, Spanish-speaking women are involved in that. They initially choose officers, and Nina Otero Warren is elected as vice president. And then the following year, the president stepped down and she became president of this organization. So she's really integral to the fight in the state of New Mexico, right? She's in charge. She's also really busy on her own. She was first appointed and then ran for and won the position of superintendent of schools in Santa Fe, which was superintendent of schools was the office that women could run for. Again, that's a school issue, so they could run for and vote. And that year, 1917, is the same year that New Mexicans, well, here's Nina again, but 1917, New Mexicans elect a man named Andreas Orestius Jones to the Senate, and he's made chair of the Women's Suffrage Committee. So he's there in the middle. So he's actually a really important person in Congress as suffragists are lobbying to try to get the amendment passed. He's the guy in the Senate that kind of is in charge of it. And I just want to point out that he brings as his clerk, Dennis Chavez, who is the guy in the cap there. Dennis Chavez worked for him and as his clerk, so he's right there in it. And Chavez, of course, later goes on to become a major politician from New Mexico. And his wife, Yamelda Chavez, is also in DC working for the Treasury Department. Again, both of them sort of witnessing this as young people. And then on the far side is the National Women's Party Washington headquarters and a petition that they give to Jones at one point. So Nina Otero Warren also periodically traveled to DC to petition Jones and work with Alice Paul. And finally, in 1919, Congress, both houses of Congress, after a very long fight, passed the amendment through Congress, and then it goes out to the states to be ratified. So they won a big battle, but they still have more work to do. So in New Mexico, right, Nina Otero Warren takes the lead on trying to make sure that ratification happens. And she's very convinced it's going to happen pretty quickly. And she actually steps down from her position in the suffrage organization, which was nonpartisan, and takes up a role as the, she becomes basically the head of the Republican Party's women's branch. So they set up their own women's auxiliary, and she becomes head of that. So she's ready to like get involved in party politics as soon as things go through. And so initially in New Mexico, it looks like it's going to pass pretty quickly, but at the very last minute, like literally the day before, it appears that some of the people who said that they would vote for ratification are changing their minds. And she is literally down on the floor of the legislature. She's in the offices, sort of whipping up votes and trying to get particularly the Republicans, which was her party, in line to vote on this. And so the state of New Mexico, finally, they vote and they vote successfully, and it becomes the 32nd state to ratify the 19th Amendment. They needed 36 total. And the next 4 states were actually pretty hard to get. But the last one, finally in August of 1920, was Tennessee. And so with 36 states, exactly 36, it becomes part of the US Constitution. So one of the things I argue in the book is that without New Mexico and without Spanish-speaking suffragists like Nina Otero Warren and Aurora Lucero, it might not have been ratified, right? It was really down to the wire. So New Mexico actually plays a really important role in that. And then I do a little bit of this in the book, but what I'm looking at next is sort of what happened after 1920. And sorry, I should have given you some warning about these headlines. These are historic documents. And so they are, again, you can see that there's some racist wording here. These are 3 headlines from the 1920s that gives you a sense of the very different ways that women from different racial groups experienced voting rights, right? So the 19th Amendment says that voting shall not be denied on the basis of sex, but it doesn't say that there aren't other ways that voting can still be denied, right? So there are other ways it can be denied. So in the South, right, under those Jim Crow laws, there are things like literacy tests or poll taxes. There are in the American West more broadly, there are also literacy tests, particularly Native people who before 1924 are wards of the federal government. After 1924, the federal government passes the Indian Citizenship Act, and so they should all become citizens. But people are still skeptical, as you can see from that headline. It's actually out of Gallup, New Mexico. This idea that Native people are not civilized and so shouldn't vote. And so in Western states, there are a lot of ways in which they keep Native people from voting. Some of it is literacy tests. In many cases, including New Mexico and Arizona, if you lived on a reservation or in New Mexico, a pueblo, you were not allowed to vote, right? And they knew that most Native people in their states didn't live off reservations. So that was a way of keeping them from voting. And that's in place in New Mexico and Arizona until 1948, until after World War II. What I'm particularly focused on, though, and I want to talk about here is Black women, because as you saw, there were some Black women in New Mexico. And you can see here that in 1925, they're interested in politics and in voting. And in fact, they had been having suffrage conversations in their communities, but they weren't usually invited into the New Mexico Federation of Women's Clubs or other suffrage organizations where Anglos and Hispanos were talking about suffrage. So they're kind of having their own conversations, but they were having them. The other thing you see here, and I'm happy to talk about it a little more in the comments, is that Nina Otero Warren, right, who jumped right into party politics, in fact, runs for Congress on the Republican Party ticket. They nominate her in 1922, right? So she immediately gets involved in politics. And in fact, Anglo and Hispanic women, the parties paid a lot of attention to them pretty initially. So she's nominated. You can see that there's a lot of interest in how women are going to vote right away in that election of 1920. Things remain in bilingual, right? The sense of, particularly for women, Spanish-speaking and English-speaking women, maybe not Native women, but they're bilingual election materials. And then these are fun. These are from UNM's archives. These are the Democratic Party's speaker itineraries for the election of 1920. And you can see that there's a number of women that they hired to go out and try to turn out women to vote for the Democrats. And in one of the letters in this collection, somebody is writing to somebody else in the Democratic State Central Committee, and he says basically the Republican women, and this is Nina Otero Warren, it's the Republican women are, really on fire. They're getting people turned out. And we've got to have women come and speak in our community because otherwise all of the women are going to vote Republican. So it's really interesting to see sort of who's on here and what they're doing. Again, Nina Otero Warren runs Spanish and English language papers carry her ads. And then she does not win. It's actually not a good election year for the Republicans. They lose pretty broadly. But as you can see, Soledad Chavez de Chacon, who is running for Secretary of State in New Mexico on the Democratic ticket, she wins that office. And she's the first woman to hold that position in the entire nation. And that position's pretty important for those of you who are interested in voting. That's the position that determines kind of how easy or hard it will be to vote in your state. So it's still a really important position. And so she wins, and then Isabella Eccles, as you see there, won superintendent of public instruction. So women, white women and Hispanic women come into the parties and they come into office. So let me just finish with this one last story, and then we'll open it up for questions. So as I said, in New Mexico, Black women are definitely involved in suffrage politics. And you see this, The Statesman was a paper out of Denver, and it published news of African-American communities throughout kind of the region. And so you'll see they'll have Albuquerque news, and they had Arizona news. And you can see that Black women in Albuquerque had a women's suffrage meeting in 1909, for example. In Carrizozo, the paper published this image, which is a caricature of a Black woman, and we can talk about why it's problematic. But what's so interesting about it is it clearly showed that Black women were part of the suffrage movement. This is a big petition that had been sent to Washington, D.C. Black women we see in one paper absolutely are part of the suffrage movement. We also see in the other paper that people were pretty aware of that, right? And then in 1920s, right? So then what happens with Black women in the election of 1920? As you recall, the Constitution has that language about not discriminating, right? Well, in Columbus, New Mexico, down south, the newspapers ran some headlines in November of 1920 about a group of Black women who had tried to vote, 60 to 70 Black women, it said, in the local election in 1920, but their voting had been questioned, right? Their right to vote had been questioned, and it actually leads to a court case in February of 1921. And in that court case, the judge ultimately rules something that's very interesting, I think. He ruled that these women, who were all wives of Army men who were stationed in Columbus, so a Black unit was stationed in Columbus. These women were all married to men in the Army. And the judge then ruled that they were not allowed to vote in New Mexico, not because they were Black, but because they were married to military men who did not have residency in the state of New Mexico, okay? Now, the women, right, one could argue, well, they're not in the military, but the judge said, well, because of the laws of coverture, which said that a woman's identity basically was the same as her husband's, legally they were one person, those women couldn't vote. Now, it seems like that's not about race, right? It's about residency and sexism. But in fact, the whole reason that they were challenged was because everybody assumed they were going to vote for the Republican Party, because this was before sort of changes in the 20th century, and African Americans were pretty solidly Republican in the early 20th. And it would have flipped the sheriff's election and a judge's election from the Democrats to the Republicans. So that's why their votes in particular were challenged. And then the ruling came down on the basis of other things. So that's what I'm looking into. And I read about that in the newspapers. And so I thought, well, I wonder if the court case is available. And so I called down to Deming, and they said, well, we have all of it on microfilm, and you're welcome to come see it. They could not photocopy it for me because, as you can see, it's in this reverse negative, and it is a really hard to read. You can see I'm taking pictures with my cell phone there. But the newspapers didn't name the women. They just said there were 60 to 70. And I thought, well, that would be astonishing. Do we have their names? And you can see that in this court case, here are the list of their names. So I'm now in the process of trying to figure out who these women were, right? They said they're the wives of military men, and that does seem to be the case. But I'm trying to find out more about them, right? Kind of what were they doing before 1920? What were they doing after? Do they stay in New Mexico? Were they politically involved before or after? just kind of, who are they and what else can I tell about their story? So one of the court records actually have some information in them. And then I want to show you the census from Columbus, because I think this is so fascinating. And this will be the last source I show you. But if you can see here, this is the row. So there's names, and then the relationship to the head of the household. And then this is sex. And this is the top one, for example, is a cursive F for female. And Ancestry actually will tell you, you can hover over it and it will tell you if you can't read cursive. And then this is race, right? So B for Black. And then age and marital status, single or married, or down here, widowed, WD. And what you see here is that all of these, right, there's a huge number of Black women. These are all Black women, female Black, in town. And many of them are the heads of their households, or it's their children, right? Or a roomer, somebody who lives with them. So head. So, right, there are a large number of Black women in this town, and they're listed here as heads of their own households. So that ruling by the judge, which said they were not residents and that their husbands were the heads of the household, is kind of contradicted here in the federal census, which I find interesting. But it was surprising to me to get these just lists of women, right? Both in the court case and in the census. So that's where I'm sort of headed with the sort of my questions after having finished the book, is particularly about these Black women in New Mexico. I'm going to stop so we have time for questions, and I'm happy to answer anything about the sources, more about the project, or whatever you want to talk about. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that excellent talk and discussion. This would be the time if we were in person where we would all clap. So you can share your applause as you can, yes. And so I will just open it up to questions. I can help moderate if needed. You can use the chat if you'd rather not come off of mute, and we'll just go from there.
So when were the Black women allowed to vote? Like, when did they allow them to, after like the court decided that their husbands were in like somewhere else? So
yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there were clearly other Black women in the state of New Mexico who could vote. So for example, I know there were women in Albuquerque who could vote. Mm-hmm. So this didn't apply to all Black women, only those Black women whose votes were challenged in Columbus. But that's a good question. And of course, in other states, right, and particularly in southern states, but not only in southern states, there were lots of ways in which African Americans, men and women, were disenfranchised up until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Right. And so that fight in other parts of the country really continues for much longer. And that's right. That's what the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, right, that they're still fighting up through the 1960s. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was huge. Basically said that states couldn't use some of these laws, right, to discriminate. It put the federal government in charge of looking at any law that had to do with voting. Any state law, the federal government looked at it first and said, no, this is discriminatory. That can't go into effect. And that was called pre-clearance. And that helped an enormous amount, but that portion of it was overturned in 2013 and by the Supreme Court. And so that's actually why we're seeing all of these discussions about voting and all of these new laws in places like Texas around voting, because that pre-clearance clause stopped a lot of discriminatory bills from going through. The other thing that the Voting Rights Act did that impacted Spanish speakers and Native Indigenous communities and Asian American communities is that and this was actually it got renewed in the 1970s, and they added language to it and said that elections had to be made accessible to people in other languages. I think it's if there's more than 10% of speakers of a particular language in your community, and I don't remember if it's by county or by state, you have to offer campaign materials in those languages. So that was a really, that really opened access for people who could, if you couldn't read English, right, it's really hard to vote. It's hard to register and it's hard to read a ballot. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and then its subsequent amendments were really important.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Great question. Yeah.
I'm going to sneak in a related question real quick. So, I'm just curious if you know whether women in Blackdom voted. And so Blackdom was sort of, okay, so Blackdom, for those of you who don't know the context, was a Black settler community between Roswell and Artesia that was founded in 1900, and it sort of was abandoned by 1925. So it was winding down by the time that the 19th Amendment was ratified. But those folks moved to Vado, which is down by Las Cruces. So it wasn't like they were not there anymore. They just moved from Blackdom over to a new homestead. So I was just curious if you'd seen them.
They should have been, right? Because they're not military. But I don't know. And that's something, yeah. What's his name? Dr. Tim, it's not Tim Schneider, that's the other guy. He wrote his dissertation on Blackdom. And I've been wanting to talk to him.
Tim Nelson.
Yes, Nelson.
Yeah.
And so, right, they should have been. And I'm also really curious if any of the women that in Columbus, right, who were in the court case were connected to Blackdom or not. So, that's further research that I have to do, but that's a great question, right? And it's hard. I mean, Southern New Mexico, right, there are a lot of people who migrated, a lot of Anglos who migrated from Texas, and Texas was a Jim Crow state and made it really difficult for African Americans and Mexican Americans to vote in Texas. There were like the poll tax was a big way of keeping people from voting in Texas. And of course, it's mostly meant to keep Black and Mexican Americans from voting, but it also means that poor whites often can't vote either because they too would have to pay the poll tax. But, there were ways around that, like, political parties would pay some people's poll taxes, white voters, but not Black and Latino voters. So anyway, in the northern New Mexico, especially in Hispanic communities, they were really worried about those Texans moving into southern New Mexico, and that kind of prejudice would, right, hurt them. And they do talk about that in the different elections. You see some of like language about, when they talk about, are we going to be like Texas? What they mean is this kind of racial prejudice going to come in and affect Spanish speakers in New Mexico? So again, African Americans were known to mostly vote Republican. And so, right, the folks from Blackdom would have faced similar kind of, I think, efforts to keep them from voting. But I don't know that for sure. And I think that's really interesting. I'd love to find out more.
I was wondering, how long did it take you to gather all of your primary sources, and then because I'm assuming that you had this idea in mind from the beginning, and now you have to get everything to support that. How long did it take you to actually find all of this? Then there's got to be this once you see a name, like one that stood out to me was the Mrs. Bias, who was the president of the New Mexico Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. and then not to jump on that and then go off this other tangent, you know what I mean? Because that would be very interesting, is to follow her story and see who she is. Because back in those days, I think it took a lot of, guts to just even come up with an organization like that and then do something. I mean, because they were probably getting bashed every single day because of it, and then same thing, Columbus and Blackdom and everything. I mean, these are fascinating because I know that they filmed The Harder They Fall, and I don't know if that's about Blackdom or another one, but there were so many, there were quite a few Black towns in the Southwest, and you don't hear about that. And so now it's all coming. So I'm just wondering how you gathered all that and then stayed focused on your subject there without just going crazy.
That's the $1 million question. It's so hard. So, when I started the book, I actually thought it was going to be I was going to draw on other historians and really kind of just synthesize, like, okay, what have people said about, Spanish speaking women voting in New Mexico? Okay, what have they said about Black women voting somewhere else? And I'll just kind of put it all together. And I ended up, getting really interested in some of the women that I came across who either we didn't know a lot about, maybe a tiny bit, but just wanting to know more and more. So I actually had a whole chapter in the book that I had to cut because it was just too much. It was about a Chinese woman who lives in the US for part of the time and then lives in China for part of the time. And so, some of it is you kind of go out and do a lot of the research and then you figure out how to put it together. But that, of course, was for a book, not necessarily for a paper, right? Or a 1 semester project. So I think your instinct is absolutely right. Like, here's a name, and you got really curious about, like, well, why'd she found this organization and what was that like? And can I find out more about her or about it? And, for me, it would be, well, is she in the census? And I don't know about CNM, but I know at UNM, you can get the ancestry.com, the library, let you have access to it. So you can go in and you can look for those census sheets and say, oh, here she is in 1920. And she, is married and has 3 children and her husband works, in the train yards. And you can actually start to get kind of a lot of information about her. I also like to throw names like that into digital newspaper databases. And I can't remember if I did with her, but that Denver paper. So they don't usually get mentioned in the Albuquerque papers, Black women in New Mexico, but that Denver paper, which was an African-American newspaper, did sometimes mention them. And some of the smaller towns, like the women, that's how I found the women in the court case. So, just that kind of sleuthing, and with women of color, and particularly Black women, it's just harder to find them, right? So in some way, it's hard to find women at all. But white women are often married to or daughters of kind of white men whose records are more often kept. Black women are pretty hard to find. Chinese women in the US, Chinese American women are hard to find, partly because US newspapers cannot spell their names correctly and don't care to, right? They don't care. Sometimes that's the case with Native women. So in some ways, there's not as many sources to find. They're harder to find, but there are fewer of them, so you don't get too overwhelmed. But yeah, just sort of starting with who are they and what can I find, and then just making sure you depending on how long you have. If you have a book, you have more time. If it's a paper in a class, right, you've really got to focus. And if you find a lot on one person, then that's what you do. If you're not finding a lot, then you might need to enlarge your parameters for your research and say, well, were there other Black women? Okay, well, what are they doing? So it's a really good question. Yeah, if you go to, it's true. If you go to UNM, you can definitely use those databases there. And they're great. The Ancestry is great. It's got the the census records. And then they also at UNM have one called the Sandborg insurance maps, which don't sound very interesting, but they actually are. So they were an insurance company, and they sent people out to all of these towns and cities across the country, and they would map, every 10 years or so, exactly what buildings were in town, and then often what they are used for. So you can find where these people live, and then you can figure out what their neighborhood looked like. Oh, look, there's a hotel across the street from their house. Oh, there's a, school down the road. Oh, here are they live by the railroad tracks, right? You can so there are lots of ways you can start to kind of build a picture about people's lives that may not necessarily be exactly about them, but if you can find one piece of information about them, then you can kind of learn more about where they're from, or, the census will tell you where they're born and where their parents were born. And again, for African-American women at this time period, like almost all of those women were from somewhere else. Very few of them were born in New Mexico. So you can get a sense of where they came from, and that tells you some interesting things too.
Since I just bombarded the chat, I wanted to make sure that Becca's question didn't get lost. So she asked, are there other aspects cut from the book that you find really important?
Yeah, I mean, that it really hurt me to cut that chapter, but the problem was that so I do write extensively about another Chinese woman named Mabel Pinghua Li, who is from New York. And then I had this woman, her name was Madame Wu Ting Fang. She was the wife of the Chinese ambassador to the United States. And the problem was their stories, like it became like the first 3 or 4 chapters of the book. And the book wasn't just about Chinese women or Chinese American women. So it was taking too long to get to those other groups. So I had to cut hers. But what her story did that I think was really interesting was showed how there's actually this international conversation between the United States and China in this period about women's suffrage, and that she interacts with suffragists in the US here. She lives in Washington, D.C., and they're in D.C. a lot. And her husband also actually, the minister to China. And then when they move back to China, when his position is over, she brings some of these ideas to China. And there is a women's movement in China. There's actually a revolution happening. It's not the communist revolution. It's a Republican revolution. They overthrow the empire, the Chinese empire, and set up a republic. And she becomes the first president of a suffrage organization in Shanghai. And she's drawing from kind of Chinese suffrage ideas and ideas about women in the new republic and that new nation and what their role is going to be. But she's also borrowing from things she learned in the US. And in the United States, suffragists in the US are actually looking at China during the revolution and thinking about what that means. They're very interested in sort of global women's rights globally. And so they're thinking about China too. So for me, that these kind of big international conversations, I couldn't really talk about it, right? That was a place where I had to stop myself. That's not what my book was about. But it's there, and it's a really interesting question that let me put because I have this, I need to screen share again. I have some suggested readings, and one of them is there's a really good book that someone actually did that for. Wait, what am I trying to do here? You guys can't see that, right? I need to share the screen. Somebody did a really good book on women in Latin America, and suffragists in Latin America, and so it's the Catherine Marino Feminism for the Americas. It's really good. If you guys want to take a screenshot of that, these were books that are either about New Mexico specifically or articles. The Marino is about kind of Spanish-speaking women in the Americas. And then that podcast with, that was KUNM, and it's a really good podcast. And I'm realizing my battery's about to die, so let me run get a cord. I'll be right back. I'm sorry. While you're taking that picture. Ignore my messy office.
How do you even take a picture? I like never go on Zoom, so
You
I
have,
think it,
All right.
yeah, I have a Mac.
do Command-Shift-3.
Okay.
I heard it.
Oh, thank you.
There you go. All right. Sorry about that. There we go. So yeah, that was one of the things I had to cut. Thank you. But that Charlotte Whaley book is a biography of Nina Otero Warren, and that one was really important. It helped me a lot, and Joan Jensen's work really helped me. So, you know, I really drew on secondary sources, right? That's such an important part of it as well. So I definitely stand on the shoulders of giants, as they say, with some of the books that have been written before. Any other questions? What do you guys, we have just a couple minutes. Does anyone want to share what they're working on? What they're interested in? Is anyone here from Southern New Mexico, from Columbus? I don't know if there anybody, I mean, Columbus is like, I guess Deming would be the closest place. Columbus is tiny.
I've
Nope.
asked that question a lot and I get crickets. People who have been through, my research is on Southern New Mexico, Columbus and Deming. So that's why I make that comment. People are like, where, what?
Well, and I downloaded your dissertation, right? It's one of the, as I started this new project to learn more about Columbus and Deming. I'm like, well, I know somebody who's written on that. And at this moment, and why soldiers were in Columbus, because they were chasing Pancho Villa, right? So, you know, that's such a fascinating story. And again, that there's several units of Black soldiers over the course of a number of years there. Yeah.
Absolutely is. Trying to leave room. If anyone else had a question, because your topic overlaps with stuff I've done so much, I feel like I could just kind of jump in and talk. So I'm holding back.
I guess for me, I'm just, because I'm not, you know, I've lived in New Mexico now for 12, 13 years, I guess. But I'm like half British, half German, and then retired Air Force, US Air Force. So, and then coming here. So I guess the curiosity would be, you know, because everything is so global now, and like maybe when were there British German settlers, you know, and how, you know, just kind of like an ancestry thing, I suppose. I know my mother, who is the German one, has got a few people over here, but I don't know if we have anyone that, you know, from our area and history and stuff to migrate this way, you know, because it's just so far at that point, you know, coming across and everything. So, and then with the railroads too, that was like fascinating, and people trying to get the railroads to go through their place, and so I am curious about those things. I'm not necessarily researching them at this point, but all of these things are kind of, you know, well, what about my history, or like people like me, you know, with just different areas. And
yeah. So, I mean, I'll say one thing is we sort of think, oh, it must have been really far and hard to travel. But once those trains come through, it's not. So just to use Nina Otero Warren as an example, her father is actually, he's murdered by land squatters on his land when she's about 5. And her mother remarries, and the guy she remarries is, I think he's like French by way of Britain. He's European, and I think it's French, but he lived in Britain for a while, and then he moved to New Mexico. And he ends up getting a job in Santa Fe. They're from Las Lunas. Her mother was a Luna, right? And so that's where she was living when her dad was killed. And then her stepfather gets a job in the government in Santa Fe. So they moved to Santa Fe. But then Nina herself she goes to school for a couple years in St. Louis when she's, I think, 11 and 12. And so that's where she learns English at first and becomes bilingual. And then her family actually hires, when she's very young, when her father's first been killed, they need a nanny, right? And they hire a woman, an Irish woman, so an Irish immigrant woman who had been working at a convent in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I don't know how they found her, but Nina's mother comes to Pittsburgh and like picks this woman up and brought her back to Las Lunas, where she raises the kids. And she's basically, with the family for years and years and years. They call her Teta, right? So when you start looking, international connections are sort of everywhere, even in New Mexico. And of course, Texas and Mexico have a huge German immigrant population. That's where like ranchero music, right? The accordion comes from the German immigrants to Mexico. So it's there, those stories are there. We just haven't always highlighted them, but there's a long history of that. Yeah.
All right. Well, and even in Columbus, there were people from Germany, England, France that came as part of some of you have read the article that I posted a couple weeks ago about the placemate in Columbus, New Mexico. And so that whole thing was about boosting the town. So the town boosters were trying to bring immigrants in to settle. And they actually had quite a wide range, interestingly enough. So one of the big merchants in Columbus, the one that some folks have said was the reason that Pancho Villa attacked Columbus, because they knew him, Sam Ravel, was Lithuanian, a Jewish Lithuanian migrant, and his family settled in Columbus. So it's a lot more diverse than you might think. And also, I mean, even talking about the Chinese migration, there were Chinese businesses in Columbus in the 1900s and the 1910s. So
when
fascinating
I'm looking
stuff.
at the census, there were several Chinese men that were in there, and then also Filipinos, because that unit of soldiers had been in the Philippines before coming to Columbus. So there was a couple families of people who were from the Philippines. Yeah. So in fact, probably a lot more kind of globally diverse than Columbus is now, right? Or even Deming. It's interesting how those changes happen. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, that's it's interesting to think of it that way. So, all right. Well, it's 3:05. So I want to say thank you again to Dr. Cahill, and thank you to all of you for attending. Grateful that you were able to make it. I will post the video in our class, and I'll also post that screenshot of the references as well, so you can get at it if you weren't able to capture it. And you can ask follow-up questions as well, and I can pass things on. So
absolutely. And thank you guys. These were great questions, and I really enjoyed talking to you this afternoon. Thanks for taking the time out of your day. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.